Hi, my name is Jennifer and welcome back to my channel, and this week it is my birthday and it's my 40th birthday. So in honour of this occasion I thought that I would tell you about 40 of my most favourite books of all time. So I have purposefully called this 40 of my most favourite books rather than my 40 favourite books because it's hard to be definitive about this. I have grouped these by category. So we've got children's books, crime, thriller, historical fiction, a tiny bit of sci-fi, classics, modern classics, and what I'm calling contemporary fiction. So some of these books are series rather than the individual book, particularly so in the children's and the crime categories. So we'll start off with children's books. And the first book that I wanted to talk about is Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery. So if you've been around here for a little while, you'll know Anne of Green Gables is one of my favourite books of all time, as is the whole Anne series. Anne of Green Gables for me is my ultimate comfort read. It just brings me so much happiness. I read it first as a child, and I have reread it several times over the years, and I just adore it. Next on the children's list is Nancy Drew by Carolyn Keene, and it was only a few years ago that I realised that Carolyn Keene is like a pseudonym for a group of authors who churned out these Nancy Drew books. You know I love my crime and mystery fiction, and Nancy Drew was one of the first sort of series that really got me into reading that genre. Next, we've got some Enid Blyton and the St Clare's series. So this series of books was set in St Clare's boarding school, and we follow a pair of twins who join the school, and they start off quite snobbish, and before too long they've like made friends and they're getting up into mischief and having midnight feasts and all kinds of fun stuff like that. And then the final book on the children's list is a series of books again. It's The Babysitters Club by Anne M. Martin. So I read loads of these books as a child. I didn't read all of them because there's loads of them. But I just really enjoyed them. Each book sort of focuses on a different member of the Babysitters Club and sort of their adventures. And I have enjoyed watching the TV series as well, but sadly that has ended after only 2 seasons, which I am quite sad about. Okay, next we'll move over to crime, mystery, thriller. And the first crime series that I want to talk about is probably my favourite crime series of all time, and that's the Poirot series by Agatha Christie. I know some people find Poirot quite annoying, and obviously he is annoying, intentionally so I think. I just really like him. I like the relationship between him and Captain Hastings. I mean, I love Agatha Christie as an author anyway, but Poirot series for me are my favourites. Next book on this list, and this is a standalone, and we're going to stay with Agatha Christie, and it's And Then There Were None. It's probably my favourite Agatha Christie. It's been a while since I've read it. I've read it several times, but I probably need to reread it again soon. So And Then There Were None is one of the most sort of loved Agatha Christie novels, set on an island where we get a group of strangers who meet, and obviously one by one they start to die. I just love the sort of like the concept of it, and it's spawned a lot of similar books on the same setup as well. The next crime series that is one of my favourites is Sophie Hannah's Culver Valley series. So this features Simon Waterhouse and Charlie Zayler, who are the 2 sort of police officers, detectives in the series. I love Sophie Hannah because of the sort of bizarre ideas that she has, and I don't know how she comes up with them. She tends to use a lot of sort of like impossible puzzle type things in her novels, in all of her novels. But this series I particularly like because I think the police sort of characters are really great characters, paired with really interesting and intriguing mysteries. Next crime series that I want to mention is by Ragnar Jonasson, who is an Icelandic author, and it's specifically the Hidden Iceland series. I do like the other series that he writes, but the Hidden Iceland is my favourite. There's only 3 in the series, and with this series I will say you must read them in order. The first book is called The Darkness, and we follow an older female detective who's coming up for retirement, and before she retires she's told that she is allowed to choose one last cold case to try to solve before she retires. This series of books is quite dark. There is a significant side plot with the main character, which carries through the 3 books, which is why I say that you really should read them in order. Next series that I want to mention is the Shetland series by Anne Cleeves. So Anne Cleeves is probably most famous for her Vera series, which I do enjoy, but the Shetland series is my personal favourite. Sadly, Anne Cleeves is not going to be writing any more of the Shetland series. This series follows the detective Jimmy Perez, living obviously on the Shetland Islands, and there's just something about that character that I really enjoy reading about. With the Shetland series, you are probably best reading it in order if you can. I didn't, and that's fine, but there is a fairly significant side plot that goes through the books in terms of Jimmy Perez's personal life, which if you can, you're probably best reading it in order, but as I say, I didn't, and that was fine. And then the final crime series that I want to mention is by Anthony Horowitz, and it's the Hawthorne and Horowitz series. So this is a crime series, obviously. I think there's 3 books so far in the series. The Word is Murder, The Sentence is Death, and A Line to Kill. I can't remember what order they're in. But these are quite fun, but also really clever. So we have a Daniel Hawthorne, who is like the detective type figure, but he is paired with Anthony Horowitz. So Anthony Horowitz has sort of put himself in the series, and he is sort of the sidekick to Hawthorne, so he's a bit like the Watson or Hastings sort of side character. They have quite sort of funny interactions, but again, Anthony Horowitz I think is really good at writing intriguing and sort of clever mysteries, which are just my cup of tea. Okay, next we'll move over to some historical fiction. So the first book that I want to mention is Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. Sarah Waters is one of my all-time favourite authors. Fingersmith is about an orphan who's part of this sort of like street gang type thing, a bit like an Oliver Twist setup, and she becomes involved in a plot to sort of try to swindle these well-off people, and we go on from there in many ways, and it's fabulous and I love it. The next book on this list is another one by Sarah Waters, and it's Affinity. Affinity is my personal favourite of Sarah Waters' novels. We follow a lady who goes visiting in a women's prison and befriends one of the prisoners there who is in prison for fraud and I think other things as well, because she is a spiritualist. The book is told in diary format, both from our main character, the lady who's going visiting in the prison, but we also get some diary entries from the female prisoner herself back before she was imprisoned, and it's fabulous and I love it. Next up, a book I'm not sure, I think I've spoken about briefly, but I read it several years ago, and this is Life After Life by Kate Atkinson. I read this with my reading group, as I say, several years ago, and I absolutely loved it. So in Life After Life, our main character dies over and over again. So start off with she'll die when she's like a baby, and then it'll flip back and imagine, okay, if she didn't die then, well, how would her life have been? And then she'll die when she's like a child, and then we carry on and see what her life would have been like. It's set against the backdrop of, I think, 1930s Europe. I think some of my reading group found it kind of confusing, and I think I probably did find it a bit confusing, but I just tried to not worry too much about not remembering everything that had sort of happened and just went with the flow, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And then the final book on the historical list is The Silent Companions by Laura Purcell. So this is a book I read a few years ago, and I can't remember that much about it in detail, but what I do remember is being completely creeped out by it. So the Silent Companions of the title are these things that people used to have, apparently, like wooden pictures of people, almost life-size, that people had around their houses. There's different reasons I think people had them, maybe to make the house look like bigger, and also as like fire guards and different things like that, but that book is so creepy. Next we're going to talk about a tiny little bit of sci-fi. I'm not a sci-fi reader, but the first book I wanted to mention is The Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham. So I read quite a bit of John Wyndham when I was a teenager and very much enjoyed his books. The Midwich Cuckoos is my favourite one, I think, and this is about the idea of collective consciousness, as in like a group mind, which I just think's really interesting as a concept. This book was made into the film The Village of the Damned, which I haven't seen because it will probably be way too scary for me. And then the next book in sci-fi that I wanted to mention is one that I read last year, and it's The Body Snatchers by Jack Finney. So I really enjoyed this book, and it wasn't quite what I expected. I haven't seen any of the film adaptations. The Body Snatchers, as you probably know, is about sort of like alien beings taking over the bodies of humans. But there was just, it was a lot more of a thoughtful book than I expected it to be as well as very plotty. So I very much enjoyed it. Right, we'll jump over now to a few classics. I'm not a big classics reader, but there are a few that I very much enjoy. And the first is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I read this for the first time a few years ago. I want to reread it at some point this year. The Picture of Dorian Gray, I always imagine classics to be kind of boring, but The Picture of Dorian Gray is very, very plotty, which I very much enjoyed, but also the writing is exquisite. Okay, the next classic I want to talk about is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I read this for the first time last year, and it wasn't quite what I expected. Like, I only knew what everyone knows about Frankenstein, and it was just really sort of interesting and touched on things I wasn't expecting it to. Very gothic, and I just thought it was wonderful, and it's a book that I very much want to reread at some point in the future. And then the final classic that I wanted to mention is one that I read earlier this year for the first time, and that's Morris by E.M. Forster. So this is sort of a gay classic. It wasn't published until after Forster's death, and it's wonderful. I really, really liked it. It's quite an optimistic book, which is probably unusual for that kind of book at the time, and it was great. So now on to what I'm calling modern classics. First up, one of my favourite books of all time, The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. So this is a book that I've read a couple of times and I just adore. We follow Stevens, who is a butler working in a big house in England, and it's about him sort of reflecting on his life and on his service and what that means, and it's a very introspective book, very reflective, and I think it's wonderful. Next up, The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. I've read this a couple of times, very much enjoy it, and it speaks to the depressive in me. Next up, Daphnes Mario. So my favourite Daphnes Mario is My Cousin Rachel, and I can remember reading it for the first time when I was a teenager and just being like astounded by it. I love it so much. And there is another Daphnes Mario on this list, and it's The Scapegoat. I think it's quite underrated. So The Scapegoat follows two men who look exactly alike, and one takes over the life of the other and starts living with his family, and we see him try to discover sort of what his relationship is to these people that he's living with, and obviously there's lots of secrets that he finds out as we go along, and it's a really great book. I think it is very underrated. Next, another one of my favourite books of all time, 1984 by George Orwell. What I particularly love about 1984 is what it says about language and the power of language. Next up, a book that I read at university for the first time, Herrera Maintains by Antonio Tabucchi. I read this in Italian. It's quite a short book, maybe we'll class as a novella even, and it's set in Lisbon in the 1930s, and we follow Herrera, who is just sort of like kind of letting life pass him by a little bit, and it's about him discovering his own agency, and it's great, you should read it. Next we have another sort of gay classic, and it's Giovannis Room by James Baldwin, which is a really wonderful book, and I think Baldwin is a really wonderful writer. And the final book on what I'm calling modern classics is a book I don't think I've mentioned before, and this book I would have always, like previously going back, have said is one of my favourite books. I haven't reread it for a long time. A lot of people like really hate this book, like actively despise this book. So I feel like when I mention it, I'm going to lose half my subscribers. But it is The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. And again, it speaks to the depressive in me. So moving swiftly on to some contemporary fiction. First book on this list is a book I read only a couple of months ago, and it's Detransition Baby by Tori Peters. I obviously knew this was like a very well loved book, but I wasn't expecting how much I loved it. I just thought it was fabulous, really great, really, I think quite an important book in many ways, and it deserves all the hype it's had. Next book is one of my favourite books that I read, I think 2 years ago now, and it's Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. I love this book so much. I need to reread it this year. I just remember reading it and being totally mesmerised by it. It's just brilliant. Love it. I need to read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell at some point this year. Next is some Japanese fiction, and it's the Traveling Cat Chronicles by Hiro Arakawa. This is a really wonderful book, told from the point of view of a cat who sort of befriends this man, and it's about them, I guess, getting to know each other and the road trip that they go on together. It's really lovely without being sickly sweet. It is quite funny in parts, and I just absolutely loved it. Next up is my favourite book from last year, and it's The Death of Vivek Oji by Akwaeke Emezi. I love this book so much. It's about identity and belonging and love, and it did make me cry, but it's still quite a hopeful book as well, and I loved it. Next, I wanted to include some Maeve Binchy on this list because I really love Maeve Binchy, and so I've included Circle of Friends. Circle of Friends is probably one of her sort of like most well-known books and sort of most loved books. We follow a group of young people in Dublin who are, I think, at university, and just their different lives and relationships and things. I love Maeve Binchy. She is a very comforting read for me. Next is a book that was in my best books of last year, and it's A Passage North by Anouk Arupragasam. This was shortlisted for last year's Booker Prize, which is why I picked it up, and I loved it so much. It's a very introspective, sort of reflective book, and I think some people don't like it for that reason, but I loved it. The writing was so lyrical. It's about a man who's going on a train journey in Sri Lanka, and it's him reflecting on his sort of past, the history of his family and his country, and I absolutely loved it. Next is a book that I read, I think 3 years ago now, and loved, and it's Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. This obviously won the book prize, and I love the sort of the characters that Bernardine Evaristo develops in this book, but I also really love the way it's written in that sort of lyrical, almost poetic way. Next is a book which I had kind of forgotten about, but I was looking through my Storygraph to see what books I'd rated 5 stars in the last few years when I was coming up with this list. And this is How It Always Is by Laurie Frankel. So this is a book about a young trans girl. I think she's about 10 years old, and it's about her and her family, and them trying to sort of support her in her coming to realise her own identity. And I believe the author has a child who is trans, so speaks from that experience. Next, another book by Akwaeke Emezi, and it's Pet. This I read last year, and it's a YA novel. In Pet, we follow Jam, who is a young trans girl, and she inadvertently brings to life this character called Pet. And Jam and Pet together sort of seek to uncover the monster who is living in their town. It is, obviously, although there are some sort of like fantastical type elements to the story, it is quite grounded in reality. There is some dark stuff in here, and I really need to read the prequel Bitter, which has only just come out. Next, some more Japanese fiction, and this is a short story collection, Revenge by Yoko Ogawa. I read this last year. Again, it's on my best books of last year list. It's a set of interconnected short stories, and they are kind of weird and dark. So we have some repeating characters, so characters who are maybe a side character in one story become the main character in another story. We have some repeated motifs and themes running throughout as well. Next, some more Japanese fiction actually. This is Lonely Castle in the Mirror by Mizuki Sugimura. This is a fantasy novel that I read last year and took me by surprise. I absolutely loved it. It's about these young people who enter this magical castle through the mirror in each of their respective bedrooms, and they are sort of tasked with different things when they're in the castle, and there's a lot about them trying to figure out why they've been called to the castle, what links them, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought it was fabulous. Okay, I've only got a couple of books left now. When I was thinking about putting this list together, I tried to think about the books that I've read over the last few years, which in some way have been really memorable for me. And so this is my Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. This is about a woman who, I think she's in her 30s, and she is sort of forced to reflect back on her time as a teenager when she was in a relationship / groomed by her teacher. And it's very much about reframing past experiences, and I thought it was a remarkable, really, really impactful book. And then the final book on this list is a book that I only read maybe a few weeks ago, and it's Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. So I love this book. This is about a couple, and one of them has just returned from a deep sea mission, which has kind of gone wrong. And when she comes back, her wife can tell that she's not quite the same. She's just different. She's acting kind of strangely, and we find out sort of a bit about what's happened and how the relationship between the two characters has been affected by this. And it's brilliant. It's really gothic, very sort of quite claustrophobic, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So those are 40 of my most favourite books ever. Let me know if you have thoughts on any of these books, if you hate, The Catcher in the Rye, which, let's be honest, you probably do. Yeah, I hope you're all doing well, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Bye.